Because it was so totally different. There was no specification. No one ever checked through your code. There was no documentation. There was no maintenance.
This is Antic, the Atari 8-Bit Podcast. I'm Kevin Savitz. Colin Hume worked at Thorn EMI for about a year, where he programmed one game for the Atari 8-bit computers, Computer War. Computer War was based on the 1983 movie War Games. Thomas Cherryhomes joined us to ask Colin some questions of his own. This interview took place on April 12, 2018.
I've always been interested in computers, and I'm a science fiction reader, and I think the two go together. When I was at university, which was 1964 to 67, there was a computer there. It was an Elliott 803 with 64K, which was a big mainframe in those days, with a room full of cooling equipment and so on. And so I taught myself to program in Algol. And then I got my first job, which was at Rolls-Royce, Aero Engine Division, where they taught me PL1. And later on, I taught myself IBM Assembler. Then I moved on to work for IBM for 5.5 years, mainly on the PL1 optimizing compiler, which again was written in assembler, so I got quite used to that. And then I moved to the stock exchange as a commercial programmer, and combined with that, I also started doing some lecturing on computer programming and computer-related subjects. And after some years, let me look at my notes. In 1983, I'd been a lecturer full-time for several years, and I decided I needed a break from that. And by that time, I got a microcomputer, which was an Apple II, long before the Apple Mac came along. It had 48K, which was a big machine in those days. And I also bought the Pascal language pack, which had an extra card which brought the memory up to 64K, which was the maximum you could have on this machine, because it was 2-byte addressing. So an address had to fit into 16 bits, and that means 2 to the 16 is 64K. So I've been working on that, and I decided I would like to try my hand at writing games. So I applied to Thorn EMI, who are a big company involved in films and all sorts of things. And they had a computer games department in Soho in London. I don't think Thorn EMI really knew what to do with the computer games department. It didn't really fit into their corporate strategy. So they put us in with the video department, which really wasn't a good fit, or the video, group. So I was writing a game called War Games as a tie-in for the film. And there was supposed to be some agreement signed by some top man at Thorn EMI and some top man at whichever film studio it was. And one of them was ill, and the agreement was never signed. So then the legal people said I couldn't call the game Computer War. I couldn't call it War Games. I had to call it Computer War. And they were very specific that I could say it was based on the film War Games, but that had to be in a much smaller font than the actual name Computer War. And I think that really meant that it wasn't going to be a success. It sold fairly well. And I had one review which said it was Thorn EMI's best ever. But it never made a fortune for me or for Thorn EMI. And I suspect that was partly because it wasn't called War Games.
Sure.
So the time wasn't so visible. So that's how I got into it. I was at Thorn EMI for about a year, and that was the only game I finished. I started writing something to do with teaching music theory, and eventually I decided I couldn't take games seriously enough, which sounds paradoxical, but it was true. I was in a team of young people. They were all about half my age. I was probably in my 40s. They were all in their 20s. And every time a new game came in, they all rushed to get a copy, and they would all play this game for ages. And I thought, no, just let me get on and work on my game. So I didn't totally fit in there. And eventually I decided it wasn't really for me. So that's game writing experience.
Was Computer War the first thing you were assigned to when you got there, or did you choose it, or were you assigned it?
I was assigned it. Somebody had started working on it. He had drawn the initial screens and produced the siren sound. When I took over the game, this siren sound was going constantly. So one of the first things I did was switch off the sound. And then later on, I only introduced the siren when the DEFCON level went up by one, so a major threat. But I took it over and wrote most of it, but someone else had done the initial work.
I see. And you mentioned another game about music theory. Did you write the music for Computer War? The theme music?
Yes, I did. Yeah, I'm a composer as well as a computer programmer. And I also wrote some music for a couple of other games that the group at Thorn EMI were working on. But it was nothing like games today. These days you have a whole team of people, and you have some of them working on the graphics and some of them working on the code and some working on the music. And it was nothing like that. It was just me. But I happened to be a musician, and so I could write a bit of code that would play the tune and combine the two together.
It's a great tune.
Thank you.
What do you remember? What other programs you composed for?
No, I'm sorry, I don't. There were only a couple. I think one was for this same group in Thorn EMI. No, it was a different department, but it was the same organisation. Another one was for somebody else, but sorry, it was a long time ago. I don't remember.
Sure. All right, so you said you were there for about a year, and this is the only thing you worked on except for the music theory game. Tell me about what that was going to be.
Well, that wasn't really so much a game as an educational program. As I said, I found I couldn't really take games seriously enough. But having been a lecturer, I'm interested in education. I like teaching people things. I think I have a flair for it. And playing music is something that thousands of people want to do. And you can go to piano teachers or violin teachers, but some of them are not very good at teaching the theory, and I'm sure they don't make it fun. So I had an idea of making it fun, but really it didn't come to very much. I didn't spend long enough time on it before deciding that really I'd had enough and I wanted to go back to doing some real commercial programming, because it was so totally different. There was no specification. No one ever checked through your code. There was no documentation. There was no maintenance. And a lot of my time in programming is maintaining other people's programs, which is hard work. There was none of that. This game went out on a cartridge, I think it was called, and they made so many cartridges. That was it. There was no second release to fix the bugs.
Wow.
In fact, after it had been released, someone came up to me and said, "Colin, look at this." And he started my game, and he pressed a button, pressed another button, pressed another button, and the whole screen went, "Bleh!" I said, "What did you do?" And he said, "Well, I pressed pause, and then reset, and then pause." And it had just never occurred to me that you would pause the game, then reset everything, and then try and restart the game from where it was. Just hadn't allowed for that.
Did you, as an employee, did you get royalties off this game, or was it just a flat fee?
I never got any royalties. I don't think I would have done, even if they'd made a lot of money. They also objected to me putting my name on it. They said, "No, we don't do that." And now it's very different. Now games programmers are world famous, and you want to say it's a game by so-and-so, but in those days it was a game by Thorn EMI, and that was it.
Did you need approval from the movie company, or did you just create a game and push it out and that was it?
Well, as I said, there was this agreement that was supposed to be signed, and because that wasn't signed, then they made all sorts of conditions. So yes, there was an agreement, but as I said, it couldn't be called war games, and the phrase war games had to be in very small type compared with computer war.
I'd like to introduce my buddy Thomas. Say hello, Thomas.
Hello.
Hi, Thomas.
Hi. Wanted to say, yes, playing Computer War, it's actually, of all of the games that Thorn EMI released, it was Actually, it was my favorite. The depth of the game was absolutely amazing, and was even more incredible for the fact that I'm assuming that you did the Atari version.
Yes, I did.
Okay. I'm actually amazed that looking at the cartridge, I've looked at the cartridge, I've disassembled the code. Excellent code, by the way. I'm amazed that you managed to fit it. It's on an 8K cartridge, but it only takes up half of the space. So you've got this entire game running in about 4K of space, which, wow.
Yeah, well, these days, of course, people assume that you couldn't run anything in less than 4 megabytes or something, but it was a very different world. As I said, the first computer I ever worked on was a big mainframe, and it was 64K or 48K, 64K. And in those days, you worked really hard to fit things in, and you learned all sorts of tricks. And you certainly couldn't have written Computer War in a high-level language. You had to be right down at the bit level, and you virtually knew what every byte in storage, in RAM, was for. It was all laid out in fixed addresses, and you controlled it completely. But yes, you're right. It was hard work. 6502 assembler is pretty low level. There are no multiply or divide instructions, for instance. You have to write a subroutine if you want to multiply two numbers together, which I was doing for working out the trajectory of bullets and how a thing looks as it comes towards you, how big it comes, how fast. So that was a bit mathematical. And yeah, the whole language was very primitive.
Extremely so. As far, and I completely understand being a 6502 coder myself still, even these days as a hobby. As far as the multiply and divide routines that you were using here, were you essentially using table lookups, or were you trying to use a series of common multiply and divides as far as for computing those trajectories? You remember?
Oh, well, I got a book called, what was it called? Musical Applications Using Microprocessors, I think.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know whether I've still got it up on my shelf. I can't see it. And that gave you a routine for doing the multiply.
Okay.
It described it as a series of additions, which makes it sound as if you're multiplying 500 by 300, you added them together 500 times, but it didn't really mean that. It was adding together and shifting, but it was not a complicated routine. It's just the fact that you had to call this routine every time. And so you had to be much more structured and logical in the way you plan things.
What were you using as your development system at the time for that machine, for that game?
I was using an ordinary Atari.
400, 800?
I think it was 800.
Okay. Basically, just do you remember which assembler that you were using at that time?
No, I don't. Sorry.
Okay. Thought I'd ask.
Sure.
Okay. Okay. Well, I mean, that's really it from my side here. Like I said, I've gone over the code. I'm extremely impressed because I've written code for the 8-bits as well, and to see that much of a game crammed into half of the 8K cartridge address space is amazing.
Well, I'm glad you think so. Thank you very much. And of course, I haven't seen the game for years and years because I don't have an Atari.
You can get emulators now that will allow you to play the game and grab the cartridge ROM off of a site like Atari Mania or grab a cartridge, whatever. So it's still available.
Okay, I'll have a look.
Or if you're super lazy, just go to YouTube and search for Computer War, Thorn EMI, and you can watch someone else play it.
Absolutely.
I didn't know that. Okay, I will do that. Thank you for the information.
Yeah.
There were versions for a couple of other platforms. Were you involved with those?
No, I wasn't. I think we had 3 separate teams, and I was just involved with the Atari version. I looked at the other versions, but I had no involvement, and there was virtually no communication between the various groups. They were doing their thing, I was doing mine. Well, there was no communication in my group either. People would come over and make suggestions about how to play it. But as I said, no one ever looked at the code and said, well, you haven't written that really well. There's a much better way of doing it. I was totally on my own, which was a new experience for me.
Were there any features that you wanted to add but decided you couldn't because of time or space constraints?
No, I don't think so. I was aware of the constraints and I was working to them. So no, I didn't try and do something much bigger than I could possibly do. I knew what I could do in the space, and I did the best I could with it.
And how long did you have to create the game?
I'm not really sure.
A week, a month, a year? I mean, just...
No, probably 6 months. So why are you still interested in the Atari after all these years?
I never lost interest in the Atari. My dad got one when I was 12 or 13 years old. I fell in love with it. I still have it on my desk. And I think it's a great, powerful little machine that was pretty incredible for the time and is still fun to play with.
Yeah. Okay, that's a good answer.
And I share pretty much the same sentiment as Kevin. I never stopped. And there are a lot of us that literally never stopped using these machines. And we've gone through and made new software for them. We've extended them, and we use them alongside our modern machines, just as, if they're brothers. So,
Yeah.
So how do you spend your time today?
Well, I'm still a programmer. I'm writing websites mainly. I also have 2 large programs of my own, which I'm constantly working on. They're written in Delphi, which I think you would call Delphi in the States, which is based on Pascal, which is based on Algol, which is the first language I ever wrote. I think Delphi is a really good language. It was produced by Borland, who basically invented the integrated development environment, but they just couldn't compete with Microsoft. And now I don't think they exist. If they do, they're certainly not doing Delphi. But it's a good language. It's like Visual Basic, only it's based on a good language, well designed, rather than Basic, which was just thrown together. So the 2 programs, one is an editor, which edits web pages, ABC music, rich text files, various things. There's all sorts of things that I find useful. So I'm using it as an editor all the time. And my other great interest is in English country dancing and American square dancing and folk dancing. I'm a caller. I'm the one who stands on stage and says, do-si-do your partner, and other strange things like that. So I've written a dance organizer, which enables me to plan my programs so I can put in the information about all the dances. And then when I'm planning a program for a particular group, I can pull in the dances that I want. And the program will tell me what I called for them last time and how many times I've called this dance, so I don't keep doing the same few. And all sorts of complicated stuff. And it will generate a bookings page for my website and so on. So I'm constantly working on that. So, yeah, I keep pretty busy programming. And if I'm not programming for somebody else, I'd be programming for myself because I still love it. And it sounds like you two do as well.
Yes, indeed. Well, I think that's my last question. If you could send a message to the Atari computer users that still exist, and you can right now, what would you tell them?
I'm afraid I'd be inclined to say, why don't you move on to a PC or an Apple Mac?
Okay. Thomas, do you have any more questions?
No, nothing from me. But I will say that, like I said, many of us that still use these machines also use them alongside modern machines. I mean, I have over here to my left, I have my Atari 800, but over here to my right, I have a Dell mobile workstation that I use for everything else. So, it's old and new, good, all in balance.
Thank you so much, Colin. I appreciate your time today.
You're very welcome.
If you enjoy these interviews and would like to contribute, there are 2 ways you can help. You can help fund these interviews directly by contributing to my Patreon. A small monthly contribution will help offset the expenses of making these oral history interviews. Contribute at patreon.com/Savitz. Or make a tax-deductible contribution to the Internet Archive, a nonprofit digital library that has done incredible things to preserve computer history. Make your tax-deductible contribution at archive.org/donate. Thanks.